hot spot out there in the car, so.
Yeah.
Well, fellow Toastmasters, honored guests, they arrive on our doorstep tired, frightened, abused, hungry, without a nickel in their pocket, sometimes alone, and unable to speak a word of English. And they're greeted, and often they're as young as 4, and they're greeted with fear, contempt, arrest, and deportation. These are our neighbors and our neighbors' children from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And these countries where these people are fleeing from have the 3 highest homicide rates in the world. While the narrative from Washington is that Hondurans are fleeing violent gangs, and they're coming here for safety, our own history tells us that gangs are often a part of organized crime, and organized crime is complicit with government at all levels. And it was true in Al Capone's time, and it's why it's important to realize that it's probably true today. It's no accident that the travel to the north is fraught with danger. People are abused, people are beaten, they're robbed. But at the heart of this, at the heart of the reason why people travel, we know that there's a very serious crisis going on in Honduras. And so in August, as a member of a human rights delegation, I decided to undertake the observation and a visit to the country to see what was really going on and to look beyond what we see in the headlines. So I'll start by saying that it was the last meeting of our trip. It was a long, exhaustive trip. We had been all over the country to rural areas, to indigenous areas, to an interesting area that is actually occupied by a group of people called the Garifuna, and they're actually former slaves who have populated on the Mosquito Coast. And they really are the very definition of what free people are. We are in the offices, it's a Friday afternoon, we're in the offices of an organization called COFRIDA, which is a Spanish acronym which stands for the Committee for the Disappeared and the Murdered. The committee was founded in the 1980s during a wave of government repression in Honduras that coincided with the Contra War. The organization is respected around the world for its thoroughness, its accuracy, and its tenacity in the face of incredible oppression and overwhelming odds. It's located off of a busy street in the old Spanish colonial area of Tegucigalpa. The walls are covered with black and white school portraits of teenagers. About half are girls, and they've all been disappeared. Berta Oliva, who's the executive director of the organization, ushers us into her office. She looks about 75, but she's actually in her early 50s. She's been the executive director for over 20 years. She looks at me and says, "Did you hear the news from San Pedro Sula?" And then we sit down, and she said, I'm sorry, I may have to cut this meeting short. But not knowing where to start, I asked her how she came to be executive director. She kind of hesitated, and then she said, "Well, anymore, my story is not unusual. I was 20. I was a happy new bride. I loved my husband. I adored him. He was the love of my life. He had just been hired. He was 10 years older than me, and he had just been hired as a college professor. He was an artist. He was a free spirit. And we had a little girl, a year and a half old, and I was 7 months pregnant. And it all came crashing down one night. We were just barely in bed when a military unit surrounded our house. It was a death squad. They barged in the front door. Camouflaged men, heavily armed, grabbed my husband, and I held on to dear life. I held on to his arm, but there were many of them, and there was too many of them, and I couldn't hold on. And they carted him off, and they kicked me, and I was worried about losing my baby. That was the last I ever saw of them, and that was over 30 years ago. Well, as you can imagine, I didn't know what to do. I looked everywhere for him. I looked in cemeteries, hospitals, the morgue, the police station, everywhere I looked for him. And I went back again and again and again to no avail. But after a few months, staff in those organizations began to take pity on me. And they put me in touch with other members in society who were going through the exact same thing. And so, that's how the committee was formed. everyone in the organization had lost a member, and everyone who works here had lost a member of their family to disappearances. My secretary says, we open at 8, but we really never close. I have to tell you that in that moment, you're frantic, you're overwhelmed, and you have no idea who to turn to, what to say, or what to do. And I see this happen time and time again when people walk into our office. They're absolutely beside themselves, and they're terrorized. And so disappearing people is not just a form of torture on the people who are actually disappeared, the victims, but it's a form of torture to the families. And never in a million years would I have thought that I would have been anything but a happy housewife. But what fate has taught me, what fate has taught me is to document, investigate, and advocate, and never give up. To this day, I don't know why my husband was disappeared, but he wasn't politically active. But I think what it was a message to the faculty that said, shut up and get in line. Berta is soon interrupted by her secretary to take a phone call. She listens intently. She grinds her teeth. You can tell she's getting angry. When she puts the phone down, she's resigned. Looking straight into my eyes, she says, in Honduras, we have no human rights. And I'm going to tell you that President Reagan, President Bush, President Clinton, President Obama, and President Bush and Secretary Clinton know the exact reason why. 5 years ago, we actually had space here in our country under President Zelaya. And ironically, he comes from a pro-business party, a very conservative party, and he favored investment in the country by bringing in big projects like dams, airports. But he was not on our side, and he was not on the side of the social movements. But his wake-up call came on the first day in office, when President Bush's ambassador handed him a list of acceptable people to serve in his cabinet. But, and as I said, for the first 2 years, he was opposed to us and our social movements. But he evolved as a person, and he evolved as a leader. And he began to see what the impact of the negative impact of free trade was on most Hondurans, including small businesses. He did 3 things that really upset the United States and the oligarchy. He raised the minimum wage to all of $45 a week. He drew closer to the other governments in Latin America that had come from their social movements. And thirdly, we found that we had undeveloped oil reserves off of the Caribbean coast. And he wanted to develop the oil and control the oil for the people of Honduras. But this really set off Exxon and Chevron and the Bush and Clinton people. So with 6 months left in his term in July of 2009, he was kidnapped from his home at 5:30 in the morning and flown on a U.S. plane to an airbase in his pajamas. Now, until I was appointed to the National Truth Commission, which was formed to discover the facts behind the 2009 coup, I knew very little of these details. But one of the most disturbing things was to discover that your Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, helped to organize and legitimize the coup, most especially because her key advisor was the former Reagan ambassador, John Negroponte, who we have accused of organizing death squads. He is very close to the oligarchy and has remained very close to them for the last 30 years. Clinton said that the coup was needed to restore democracy. But we had a democracy. The coup was carried out to allow the oligarchy and U.S. businesses to conduct business with impunity and to conduct business freely. And the Clintons have been pushing free trade down our throat for the last 20 years. Since the coup, we've been terrorized by the government, and the government is essentially a mafia. Our country is totally destabilized, and there is no longer a civil society. The coup has killed thousands, smashed unions, stolen the public employee pension fund, and a third of all school-aged children have no school or teacher. After stealing the election last spring, they tear-gassed the National Assembly when the opposition party took their seats. And then they fired the Supreme Court in the middle of the night, along with every independent judge in the country. I don't think that that's a democracy. And they've wreaked havoc on people's lives by creating false economic crisis that has caused basic commodities like food and gasoline to double in the last 3 months. Berta's getting more and more angry, but she stops and collects her thoughts. That call I just received from San Pedro Sula is from the city that has the highest homicide rate in the world. Last night, 8 students were massacred while playing soccer. 2 were dental students. And this is the work of the government. They're trying to cow the populace with fear. The news media, which is owned by the oligarchy, is telling people that the victims were gang members, but that's a lie. We are pretty certain that it is a government security force. And they'll get away with it because 9 out of 10 homicides in this country never get investigated. So let me tell you about gangs. First, their main purpose is to extort money from every possible legitimate business source. That's why so many middle-class people want to live. Honduran small business people cannot make a living. The gangs are controlled by the military and the police who are fighting a turf war because the gangs are so lucrative. How can someone who's been extorted actually go to the police and then expect the police to be able to investigate when that extortion money is lining their pockets? The police and the military, in turn, are run by the government, which in turn serves the oligarchy. The oligarchy is involved in the international drug trade, and the oligarchy are the business partners of your corporations, who expect your government to protect their investments. Most of your corporate profits come from countries like ours. And everyone in Honduras who is not part of the oligarchy, not part of the ruling families, pays the price. And we're being crushed. Honduras is a living hell. You must tell your countrymen to do 2 things. First, stop funding the Honduran government. They're killing us with that money that you call security assistance. Second, stop free trade, because NAFTA and CAFTA is starving us to death. Berta's appeal amounts to a prayer to us. It amounts to a prayer for our country. And every sector in Honduras has had the same plea to us. Every sector that we talked to said the exact same thing. So I have to tell you that the children of Honduras face a bleak future. Teenagers are forced to join gangs, and they're faced with a question that offers a choiceless choice. Do I stay and die here? Do I die en route to the north? Do I die in detention in a U.S. prison? Or do I face life in a hostile country? It's a question that no 14-year-old should ever have to ask. Yet it is the reality. What's the future when your family has been forced off of their farm? What's the future for you working in an American sweatshop sewing underwear for pennies a day? To the 14-year-old courageously seeking freedom and human dignity, she won't be accorded either by the Obama administration or the Republican Congress. President Obama has deported 2 million people since taking office. Hillary Clinton, who once wrote, "It takes a village to raise a child," recently said on CNN, "We need to send them back. Just because your child gets across the border doesn't mean she gets to stay." So I'm going to ask you, regardless of whether you are a rock-rib Republican or a die-hard Democrat, I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. First, join me in opposing the administration's appropriation request of nearly $4 billion for the military and police of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. This money will either be stolen by a corrupt government or used to kill our neighbors. This is critical, and this is what the people of Central America want more than anything else. Stop the funding they plead over and over. Second, because of the violence, because of the impunity, and because of the poverty imposed by NAFTA, anyone coming from these countries, regardless of age or gender, is a refugee and deserves refugee status and protection. By every legal definition, by every treaty this country has created and signed, these, our neighbors to the south, qualify as refugees. So to join me in demanding that the administration and Congress respect our neighbors' right to immigrate as guaranteed to all of us by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As Martin Luther King said nearly 50 years ago, we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Nowhere is this more glaring than in how we are treating our neighbors and our neighbors' children from Central America. Thank you.